Gapology Radio podcast with authors Mark Tinas and Brian Brockhoff. We can be reached at gapology.org, and our books can be found at amazon.com.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Gapology Radio podcast. This is your host, Brian Brockhoff, and this is the place where you find all things Gapology. I'm going to give Mark Tinas a call and see where he's at this week.
Brian.
Hey Mark, how are you?
I'm great. How's it going?
Good. Hey, congratulations. Yeah, we officially launched the podcast last week with 6 episodes posted.
Wow. That's great. I saw the 5,000 views were passed yesterday, so great job.
Yeah, that's awesome. Hey, so what's going on this week?
Well, I'm down in Dallas, Texas, one of my favorite cities, doing some work down here. I know Bob is in Uganda, Africa, teaching some gapology and other things down there, and I know you're in Kansas City, so we got a lot going on.
Right, yeah, all over the place. Do you have your Stetson hat on?
And my boots, right?
And your boots and spurs. Well, you have to fit in.
You got to visit Dallas more often. It's not like that anymore.
What?
It's very metropolitan.
Okay, I'll have to check it out. So what's happening?
Well, I want to talk about the knowledge gap today.
Oh, perfect.
You ready to go?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So the knowledge gap out of gapology, one of the 3 gaps, is the biggest gap. So I wanted to talk to the team today, and maybe there's those out there that haven't heard of gapology. And gapology is about how to identify and close the knowledge gap, the importance gap, and the action gap, which moves a team to action. But the knowledge gap is key because it is the biggest gap. You can't just close the knowledge gap and get action, but it's the biggest gap. So you've got to overcome it. So we've learned so much about the knowledge gap that I want to share. So the knowledge gap, if you're looking at a team, it's the what to do and how to do it, is the gap between knowing what to do and not knowing what to do. So you can picture that it is of great significance to someone who is intending to take action. They can't have knowledge gaps. So gapology, as a refresher, was a study comparing the top 10% of performers with the bottom 10% of performers and sort of ignoring the middle 80%. So when we looked at that top 10% and compared them with the bottom 10%, one of the biggest shocking differentials was the knowledge gap. And why it was shocking was literally the top 10%, what we call the A group, didn't have knowledge gaps in their team. The C group was riddled with knowledge gaps. We found in the A group the lowest level of associate often knowing more than the leaders in the C group. So the knowledge gap was this huge differentiator that really got us started down the road of gapology and understanding how to identify and close gaps. And, one of the biggest things was that the A group, that top 10%, those leaders owned knowledge gaps. If there was a knowledge gap in their team, they took blame for it. It was their issue. And that's such a fundamental key to knowledge gaps. Whose issue is it? Right, Brian?
Right, yeah, who owns it?
Who owns it? If your team doesn't know what to do or how to do it, is that their issue or yours as the leader? So what we found in the A group is they owned it. And because they owned it, the gaps disappeared. I mean, you'd have to hunt high and low for a knowledge gap in that A group. They'd seal them shut. And if you're an individual contributor on a team, it's not that much different. Look at yourself first off, close all of your knowledge gaps, and then work with those that you influence and those that you need to perform around you, whether they report to you or not, and help them close their knowledge gaps, and everything will get better. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, exactly. And to that point, those winning leaders, those are the ones who own their own knowledge gaps. So if their bosses were delivering something that they weren't comfortable with, they own that, and they really dived into it and figured it out how to overcome that. They leveraged their peers. They didn't just allow a knowledge gap within themselves.
Yeah, that's key. So if you stay right there for a minute and look at the behavior of the A group and the C group leaders in comparison as it relates to knowledge gaps. So we already said that the A group owned the knowledge gaps. In contrast, the C group, we saw frequently, would blame their team for knowledge gaps.
Yeah,
It was their fault.
Yep.
So that was huge for us to see that, whereas the A group owned it. And then the difference in the behavior. So the A group leaders led with questions. They would ask questions. They were curious. The C group had more of a tell people what to do to create action. The A group asked questions, and leaders that ask questions, what that does is that exposes knowledge gaps. So there's a knowledge gap, and then you can close it. The C group's blind to the knowledge gap because they tell. When you tell someone something, you don't expose the knowledge gap, so you can't close it. So just the comparison of the leadership styles for us was shocking. And this is one of the biggest reasons why the A group's the top 10% and why the C group's the bottom 10%. I'm sure you see the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's really key, that tell versus asking mentality. Telling, when you have that command leadership style, you're preventing questions. Not only just ignoring them, you're preventing them.
Yeah. I often say in the workshops that I conduct that weak leaders tell, great leaders ask. And there's just such a difference in the outcome. So
yeah, exactly.
Anyhow, so that's huge. So what we did in Gapology then, if I can go on, Brian, is we identified in the A group the 3 root solutions that they used to close the knowledge gap. And that's in the book. Those are chapters in the book. So the 3 root solutions are talent, training, and teaching. So briefly, I want to walk the group through those 3 things because we found those 3 things, again, to be the key differentiators. And I want to make sure everybody understands those. So the first one I'll talk about is talent. So the A group had a more talented team. And with a more talented team, higher skill level, in other words, there were less gaps automatically. So we said, okay, what's causing this? We saw better hiring practices, better vetting processes, but also just the leader's behavior around asking questions and immediately closing knowledge gaps helped develop the team. So the A group had a much better team than the C group. Talent was a big differentiator. So never compromise on talent. When you got someone who's growing and maturing and becoming more talented every day, take a risk there. Always err on the side of talent. The skill level matters. So that was the first big aha. Any thoughts on that one, Brian?
Yeah, no, I just saw this exact example happen where by bringing in someone who had talent, immediately started closing knowledge gaps within the team. And I think largely that was because of his transferable skills. He had the skills and knowledge from previous roles, so he was immediately able to start closing knowledge gaps.
Yeah, so to simplify it, the higher the talent level of the team, the less gaps you have. The next one is training. So we found that the A group had a better trained team than the C group. That's rather obvious. I think everyone would imagine that would be the case. However, within the A group, we found something amazing. We did a podcast on it. We call it the habit ladder. So we found that the A group leaders figured out how to get their team to habit level behaviors. Repetitive habit level behaviors create action. And so we did a podcast on that. So listen to that one. We wrote about habit ladder in the knowledge gap piece of Gapology. So read through that. The habit ladder type of mentality where you're bringing repetitive behaviors to habit level was absolutely evident in the A group, and you couldn't find it in the C group. It was a big differentiator. The other thing that occurs to me when I think about training is the leaders that tell don't value training. They just tell. So you do have to value training. You have to understand that habit level behavior is going to get you a consistency of execution that you can't get otherwise. So look at yourself, look in the mirror. Are you a leader that barks out direction? If so, you're not going to be the top performer. You've got to change. You got to ask more questions. You got to value training, and you've got to learn this habit ladder. And it's key in training people. If your training does not equal the habit ladder, it's not good enough.
Hey, Mark.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing too that I'm thinking on this thing, because you mentioned that barking orders isn't going to get you there. You have to ask questions and that type of thing. So I started looking at the knowledge gap. So the knowledge gap is really the what and the how. So does the team know what to do? Do they know how to do it? So really we're talking about knowledge and skills. And the only way to validate knowledge and skills is really to ask. You have to ask them, you have to say, tell me. So tell me what you know about X. That's how you validate knowledge. And then the skills is show me.
Yeah.
So tell me and show me. Those are the things that are going to validate your knowledge and skills.
Yeah, those are great tactics for leaders. Thank you for sharing that. Mm-hmm. Lastly, and another chapter out of Gapology, another root solution here, the final one under the knowledge gap is teaching. So we found that the A leaders were teachers and the C leaders who were failing were not. And there we stood and we looked at it and said, well, of course. Yeah, why didn't we think of that before? It was staring us in the face. The A leaders, the top performers were teachers. The bottom performers were not teachers. If you're barking orders, you're not teaching. So this was, obvious, but huge. We talked to over 1,000 leaders in total, and we interviewed the top performers, and we interviewed the bottom performers. And the big contrast here was that the A leaders thought that their job was to teach, and the C leaders didn't have it on their list. So if you think about working for that A leader, you would get better every day. It would feel good to work for that A leader because they would teach you. Your skills would grow. Your knowledge would grow. You would get better. You would get promoted. You would move on. In the C group, you were just expected to do your job. So the contrast couldn't have been bigger. And the understanding of top performance versus bottom performance couldn't have been more clear. The A leaders thought their job was to teach, and the C leaders did not. So as leaders, as you look at gaps in your organization, in your team, and in yourself, start with the knowledge gap. It's the biggest gap. Close the knowledge gap, and then you're well on your way to beginning to close the importance and the action gap. So Brian, I turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. This was a great episode. Definitely leaders need to start with the knowledge gap. If they're looking at their organization, looking at are they meeting expectations or not, absolutely you have to start here. This is the foundation that everything else is built on. All right, Mark, have a great week.
Thanks, Brian.
Yep, bye-bye. All right, everybody, that's our podcast for this week. Thanks for joining us. Feel free to send in questions, comments to gapologist@gmail.com. Everyone have a fantastic week. We'll talk to you soon.
This has been a production of Gapology Institute. Visit us at gapology.org.